Peter Schrag wrote a piece for the American Prospect that is troubling. It's interesting. I wrote several pieces about this in 2002, 2001, and 2002 when George W. Bush became president, about the Reichstag fire. I saw at that time Bush's authoritarian tendencies and his willingness to lie and use war as a political weapon. And he was pretty upfront about it. I mean, it's what he told his biographer and everything else. And I was very worried that he was the guy, that was really going to take us down, take our country down. He's the guy who really damaged our country, George W. Bush, arguably the worst president in the history of the United States. He lied us into another war the same way LBJ lied us into Vietnam. The same way McKinley lied us into the Spanish-American War for political purposes and to benefit his donors. But Donald Trump is now occupying the White House. And this is something. Today is the anniversary of the fire in 1933, on February 27th, 1933. This day in history, as it were, is the day that Marius van der Lubbe was, according to some historians, taken through an underground tunnel into the Reichstag Gebäude, into the Parliament building. And, and there were all these tapestries hanging in the walls and basically just lit them on fire, which then proceeded to light the building on fire. William L. Scherer, in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is still the most authoritative book on the history of Hitler's Germany, even though William Scherer is no longer with us, he said there was enough evidence to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that it was the Nazis who planned the arson and carried it out for their own political ends. So Peter Schrag then, in his piece for the American Prospect, the headline, "Could there be an American Reichstag fire? Don't underestimate Trump." The headline kind of gives it away. This is reposted over at alternate.org. Within hours of the fire. Now, in the piece that I wrote back in 2001 or so for Common Dreams, which got reprinted in my book, We the People, I pointed out that Hitler had been dining with, as I recall, von Papen, might have been Bismarck. It was one of those guys. He was dining with the guy who was the president of the Republic. He was the chancellor, sort of like president and prime minister. The prime minister's the actual guy who has the power. Hitler had the power. Might have been Hindenburg, in fact. In any case, he was having dinner with this guy, and he got word that the Reichstag was on fire, and it was just several blocks away. He ran down the street to this place and got in front of a radio microphone. Back then, everybody listened to the radio. This was before television, 1933. And said, "This fire is a sign from God." Seriously, Hitler said that. And so now to the history lesson, this, from this piece by Peter Schrag in the American Prospect. Within hours of that fire, hundreds of people were arrested and put in protective custody or sent to concentration camps. And the next morning, in the words of Cambridge University historian Richard Evans, quote, "The cabinet, which still had a non-Nazi majority, met to draw up an emergency decree that abrogated civil liberties across Germany. Signed by President Hindenburg the same day, that would be tomorrow, would be the anniversary. Signed by President Hindenburg, it abolished freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. And it abolished freedom of the press. It suspended the autonomy of federated states, such as Baden and Bavaria, legalized phone tapping, the interception of correspondence, and other intrusions." Now, after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was proposed, I wrote a very similar article, drawing parallels between the enabling acts in 1933 of the Nazis and the Patriot Act. But continuing with this article by Peter Schrag, the decree was the first of two major measures that eliminated all institutional checks and gave Hitler absolute dictatorial powers. The second, passed a month later by the Reichstag, by the parliament, gave Hitler plenary power, the power to enact laws without any action from the parliament whatsoever. Quoting Evans again, quote, "The Nazis used them to bludgeon their opponents into submission and their allies into compliance. By the summer of 1933, all opposition had been crushed. More than 100,000 communists, social democrats, and other opponents of the Nazis had been sent to concentration camps. All independent political parties had been forced to dissolve themselves, and the Nazi dictatorship had been firmly established." And let me remind you, in the fall of 1933, in the face of this, 1 million people assembled in the streets of Berlin to protest Hitler. What good did it do them? Not a whole lot. It faded out. It's like people said, well, you know, okay, he's got that power now. Okay, Trump's got that power now. Now, obviously, we're not the same thing as Germany. But, you know, could we be? The author of this piece in Alternet says, "But as a refugee from Hitler, class of 41, I'm too much aware of the extent to which the Nazis were underestimated as low-class clowns and thugs until it was too late. Similarly, in the past election, the media, the pollsters, the Democrats, and millions of other Americans, and not just the left, also underestimated Trump. In that context, I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt's post-war observation that, quote, in 1933, indifference was no longer possible. It was no longer possible even before that." And then he says, we have troubling signs. The willingness of the Republican leadership in Congress to excuse Trump's arrogant contempt for conflict of interest laws and ethical standards. Its spineless refusal to call for an independent investigation of the links between Trump and his people with the Kremlin. The administration's draft memo on activation of members of the State National Guard and the apprehension, investigation, and detention of aliens in the United States. Trump's call for extreme vetting of Muslims. The attacks on Mexican immigrants as criminals and rapists, the vastly broadened deportation criteria, accepting only the dreamers, the America First mantra in favor of isolationists, anti-Semites, and Nazi sympathizers in the years before Pearl Harbor, the invocation of alternative facts, Trump's attacks on the courts and so-called judges, and the media as the enemy of the people. John McCain, yes, Republican Senator John McCain, said, when you look at history, the first thing dictators do is shut down the press. So, you know, he goes on through this. But could there be a Reichstag fire in the United States? And what do you do with this piece, Igor Bobek over at the Huffington Post, the first 100 lies, the Trump team's flurry of falsehood. The president and his aides succeeded in reaching the mark, 100 lies in only 36 days. And then they go through and list them. You know, every single one of Trump's lies, which is, you know, a pretty startling, it's a damn startling list, 100 lies in 36 days. And, you know, and the big problem, the big mistake that the press makes is that they'll repeat a Trump lie and then say, but that's not true. But in order to repeat it, you've got to, you know, when you hear the thing repeated, you have to form it as a positive in your mind before you can turn it into a negative. We need to change the way we're reporting on Trump. So do you think that it's possible we could have a Reichstag fire, or are we witnessing one in slow motion right now? Because all the Reichstag fire did was provided Hitler with an enemy. Marius van der Lubbe was defined as a communist. He was Dutch. He was a young man from Holland who was probably schizophrenic or possibly profoundly mentally retarded or in some other way mentally disabled. And he was maneuvered by the Nazis into burning the Parliament building so that they could say, oh, yeah, this guy is a communist. You know, sort of like Lee Oswald, right? Joining the American Communist Party and trying to go to Cuba, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Yes, we need a patsy. Well, that's what they did. They got their patsy and Marius van der Lubbe. And it provided Hitler with an instant okay, the communists are after us. We need to crush the communists. And their fellow travelers, the social democrats, what today we would call the Democratic Party. And the communists would have been, I guess, the Bernie-crats and the Greens. We got to crush them. And along with them, we have to crush the news media. We have to destroy its credibility. We have to shut down the presses. We have to lock these people up. And then they went from there after the labor unions. They went after the church. They went after basically any place where resistance could be organized, the universities. And then, finally, although the Jews had been their favorite scapegoats all along in this, finally the final solution. So-called. But what if it's actually happening right now as we look around? I mean, you've got the President of the United States discrediting the press, saying that the press is fake news, is the lying press, using basically Hitler's phrase, Lügenpresse. Lügenpresse. We have the President of the United States saying this. We have the hyping of every single attack in the United States by anybody whose skin is dark or who is Muslim. Absolute hyping of it. And not just there. I mean, this is pervading our institutional memory. I wrote another article this weekend, and in it I wanted to talk about the killings of a number of African Americans. And I was looking at the Wikipedia site for Michael Brown. Now, when that cop killed Michael Brown, he had no idea that Michael Brown had snatched some cigarillos from a convenience store. He had no idea that Michael Brown had actually committed a crime. The crime that he was concerned about was a large young black man walking down the street rather than walking on the sidewalk. And basically shot him for that. But if you read the Wikipedia entry, the first couple of paragraphs are all about how Michael Brown was such a thug and was, robbing a convenience store and assaulting its owner. Well, that had nothing to do with the Michael Brown case. But hey, let's start out with character assassination. He's a black guy. This is happening. I mean, it's not just the right-wingers who are constantly rewriting Wikipedia. And I'm telling you, it's gotten pretty bad. Same thing with the Sandra Bland's site. I went to that site, and I was like, oh, my God, this has been rewritten by right-wingers. So we've got this incredibly divisive white power, white nationalist bunch, white supremacy bunch that are trying to rewrite our history. You've got their television networks, Fox so-called News, and their radio networks, right-wing hate radio all across the country, in every town in America, promoting these ideas that good white Americans should hate and fear people of color, people who are not Christian, anybody who identifies themselves as liberal. Oh, my God. They want to tax the billionaires and use that money to pay for health care for poor people. We can't have that, because that's what Obamacare is, by the way. They raised taxes on billionaires and used it to pay for Medicaid. And Donald Trump is going to undo that because he's a friggin' billionaire. So are we watching our own version of the Reichstag fire happening in slower motion right in front of us? And will we see the apotheosis of that? Will we see the peak of that? Will we see the flowering of that tomorrow night at the State of the Union address? Who is Donald Trump going to tell us to hate? Who is Donald Trump going to tell us to fear? I guarantee it's not going to be the billionaire class that has been systematically taking this country apart over the last 35 years. I can virtually guarantee it's going to be people who are not Christian and whose skin is not white. And to a lesser extent, people who are not male. And this is, the slow motion Reichstag fire. It really concerns me. I mean, this really concerns me. I was looking around at Alexa numbers over the weekend at some of the progressive websites, and it looks like some numbers are starting to slide a little bit in the last couple of weeks. Why? Maybe people are just exhausted. I mean, Trump has been doing this blitzkrieg, the lightning attack, on everybody. We need to stay engaged, fully engaged.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And we need to call this stuff out. I mean, they are working this thing as hard as they can, you know, doing press conferences every day, getting it televised on all the networks. They are working hard.